So I'm sitting here in the shrine room at Adhisthana now, next to this painting of the refuge tree of the Triratna Buddhist Order. So this painting was done by Chintamani, an order member. And I'll just tell you a little bit about it. At the center of the refuge tree, on a lotus, is Buddha Shakyamuni. So the whole Buddhist tradition comes from Buddha Shakyamuni. It begins with him. Everything grows out of him. Everything goes back to him. On either side of Buddha Shakyamuni, we have the Buddhas of the past era and the Buddha of the future era, Dipankara and Maitreya, symbolizing the fact that Buddhism, the Buddhahood, constantly reappears in different ages at different times whenever the conditions and the need arises. Below the Buddha, we have our own, or in front of and just below the Buddha, the Buddhas, is our own teacher, Urgyen Sangharakshita, and his teachers, his 8 main teachers who he met in India and Nepal when he was living there in the 1940s and 50s and early 60s. Over on the far side, from where I'm sitting, we have the Bodhisattvas representing the qualities of enlightenment, Avalokiteshvara, compassion, Manjughosha, wielding the sword of wisdom, Vajrapani, liberated, enlightened energy, the dark blue figure, Kshitigarbha, the compassion that will descend even to hell to liberate beings, and Green Tara, the quintessence of compassion and the wisdom swiftly attained. Then over on this side, we have the personal disciples of the historical Buddha, Sariputta, Moggallana, Ananda, Mahakashyapa, and Dharmadina. Dharmadina, one of the women disciples, famed for her great wisdom. And then behind the Buddhas, the Dharma texts, the Buddhist scriptures of all the Buddhist traditions, all the teachings, all the practices of the Buddhist tradition. And then above the Buddhas, the great teachers of the Buddhist tradition, from India, from Tibet, from China, and from Japan. All, or at least a selection of the great teachers of the tradition. So Buddhism constantly renewing itself, transforming itself as it moved from different cultures over the centuries. Above, the great teachers, the 5 jhinas, the 5 archetypal Buddhas, again representing aspects of Buddhahood, removed, if you like, from historical personality, just the pure qualities of enlightenment. And above them, Vajrasattva, the quintessence, the essence of Buddhahood, beyond time, beyond form, beyond words, but nevertheless representing here, Vajrasattva representing the unrepresentable, the wordless, pure essence of Buddhahood. So this is the refuge tree, but an important part of the image is also ourself, standing before the image with our mother, with our father, with all beings, and going for refuge again and again for the benefit of all beings, together with all beings, going for refuge to the Buddhas, to the enlightenment he discovered with all beings and for all beings. So over these next months, I'm going to be doing a series of little talks on the Bodhisattva Ideal, the path of the Bodhisattva. So Buddhism began with the Buddha, as we just saw on the refuge tree. Everything came from the Buddha. And the Buddha was a man, a human being who had everything, a prince. He lived a very good life, but there was something missing. There was more somewhere that was needed. He just wasn't happy. He wasn't satisfied. He saw old age, he saw sickness, he saw death. And in the end, he left everything. He left the palaces, the life of pleasure, and went off seeking for truth, seeking for the deepest meaning in life. And he searched and struggled for 6 years before he found the enlightenment of the Buddha, the profound peace, wisdom, understanding, compassion of Buddhahood. He spent 6 weeks absorbing the immensity of what he discovered. And then he set off. He set off to share what he discovered with others. First of all, 5 of those who'd been his disciples in his search and struggling, and who deserted him when he abandoned the harsh asceticism and renunciation and began to eat good, simple food again. He found them, he communicated with them very quickly, over a few days, maybe a couple of weeks. All of them came to the same wisdom and compassion of the Buddha. And there seemed to have been a tremendous energy, a tremendous attractiveness to the Buddha at this time. He radiated something, and very quickly there were 60 disciples who had seen deeply into the wisdom and compassion of the Buddha. So he gathered them together, and he sent them out in every direction, these first 60 disciples, to teach for the benefit, the welfare of all beings. He himself was enlightened, we think about 35 years old, and he spent the remaining 45 years of his life wandering and teaching from place to place. In the monsoons, the rainy season, he'd stay in one place and meditate, but the rest of the time he seemed to be constantly wandering, meeting people, responding to whoever he met, offering them whatever was going to help them on the path to greater love and wisdom, deeper compassion and understanding. And even at the very end of his life, an old man of 80, he'd been sick through the monsoon season, very close to death, but nevertheless, he pulled his strength together and he set off with Ananda on a last journey to try and give of himself once more to his disciples, seeking to rouse them, inspire them, encourage them. And even in his very last days, last hours as he was dying, another wanderer came asking to become his disciple. The other disciples wanted to turn him away, but the Buddha said, no, let him come, let him come. Right to the very end, he was giving of himself. So there was this tremendous love and compassion, concern for the welfare of others that came from the Buddha. And this was very much alive and a part of the Buddhist tradition. But human nature being what it is, people began to take on board a more self-centered idea of this spiritual life. They began to think of my meditation, my insight, my practice. It's the way our human minds work, and it's maybe something particularly in the 21st century, the very strong individualism that we, as part of our world and culture. We really have to watch that. For us, Buddhism doesn't just become, just a very nice cream or icing on the cake of a good life. rather than this real wish to get to the very heart of what it is to be a human being, to really get to the heart of life and discover that deepest wisdom and deepest love of the Buddhas. So, if we see Buddhism as this movement beyond self-clinging, a constant movement beyond self-clinging, and if we see this tendency, this very human tendency to want to settle down, to have a more comfortable life, to refer everything back to oneself, we see the Buddhist tradition having to revitalize itself, refresh itself again and again over the centuries. Buddhism has had to move to different cultures, different conditions, different ages, and again look how best to communicate this wisdom and love and compassion of the Buddhas in a way that's effective and meaningful to people at different times, different cultures, and work against that tendency to settle down, to comfort, to refer it all back to ourself. So part of this renewal of Buddhism over the centuries has been again and again this insistence that the spiritual life, that the Buddhist life can't be lived selfishly. And a very significant renewal that happened in the early centuries of Buddhism is known as the Mahayana, the Great Way. And this involved the emphasis on what became known as the Bodhisattva Ideal, the dedication of oneself to enlightenment, not just for one's own sake, but quite explicitly, one dedicates oneself to enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. So the Buddha, the historical Buddha, before his enlightenment, in the early scriptures, he's spoken of as the Bodhisattva, the enlightenment being, the being on his way to enlightenment. And in the Bodhisattva ideal, any of us who really seriously take that injunction that we can't gain enlightenment just for ourselves. It has to be a movement completely beyond all self-clinging, where we just quite naturally and spontaneously more and more recognize our own spiritual development, the welfare of all beings. They're just bound up together. They can't be separated out. So the Buddha before enlightenment was known as the Bodhisattva, and the Bodhisattva in the Mahayana tradition is the being dedicated to enlightenment for the welfare of all beings. Yes, the Buddhist life can't be lived selfishly, and the Bodhisattva dedicates themselves to the development of great wisdom, maha prajna, seeing the truth of shunyata, seeing the truth of emptiness, looking to cultivate a way of being empty, free of all greed, all hatred, all ignorance. To enter into what's sometimes spoken of as the open dimension of being. So emptiness is something tremendously alive and positive to be realized by the Bodhisattva. No clinging, no aversion, no ignorance, complete inner freedom, creativity and clarity. And inseparable from this, great compassion, mahakaruna, the boundless love and compassion flowing out to all life. And the path of the Bodhisattva, the way of the Bodhisattva, is spoken of in terms of developing the perfections, the 6 perfections of dana, generosity, shila, ethics, kshanti, patience, virya, energy, jhana, meditation, and prajna, wisdom. So this path of the Bodhisattva, which can be described in terms of the perfections, it can be seen as having 2 levels. There's the mundane level, where we're just trying to develop greater generosity, to live more ethically, to free up our energy, to develop greater patience and understanding, to deepen our meditation, our mental clarity, and to understand things more deeply, truly as they are. But then there's another dimension to the path where the wisdom, the truth of shunyata begins to enter into our being more and more, where we begin to move more deeply beyond self-clinging. And there we enter the transcendental path of the Bodhisattva and begin to practice the perfections at a deeper, truer, higher level. So wherever we're at, we can practice the perfections, whether initially at the mundane level and eventually at the transcendental level. So this is the path that I'm going to be talking about to you over the next talks. The path of the Bodhisattva, the path of the perfections. So I'm going to leave it there for today and wish you well.